Okay, our next speaker is Graham Hazel. He works at Geomatics, and he's a computer scientist, and he will tell us something very interesting. Video games.
Okay, yes. More about the making of games rather than the games themselves, if that makes sense. I'm no longer actually at Geomatics, but I'll talk about that a bit later on. And I'm originally a mathematician many years ago.
You're still a mathematician.
So anyway, what's this talk about? Shape influences lighting at all scales, and actually this was mentioned earlier in the day. The microstructure of a surface affects how light interacts with the material, and that's really what appearance is, how light interacts with the material. At the larger scale, shape of objects, they cast shadows, larger scale image features. Something I won't actually talk about, in photography and cinematography, artists use the shape of light sources to sculpt images. Bigger light sources will typically give you a softer light and a smoother shadow. That's very important certainly in cinematography. But the question I want to explore is how do we understand shape when we're producing computer graphics? But first, a completely sort of gloriously hand-wavy model of scientific progress. So this is something that I saw recently, which is a huge generalization. But the idea is that in the first phase of trying to understand a field or a problem, you will indeed try to use a reduced model, let's say, to simplify a problem down to some essential variables with some predictive power. And then in the second phase, that's usually when computing power and the power of statistics you can bring to bear a bigger problem, a bigger system. But then the true solution is usually more complex than that. So to try and put some meat on these bones, an example might be genetics. The first progress in genetics was made in the 19th century with Mendel and his pea plants, and that was very much simplifying down to a very simple abstraction, but still has some power. I would say we're probably now in phase 2. We can use very powerful statistical methods to say interesting things about genetics. But the real answer, how does a genome work? How does an organism grow and express a whole genome? I think we're going to need more breakthroughs to really understand that problem. So, but in this framework, what can we say about understanding of light? Well, this actually really started in a surprisingly long time ago, perhaps 1760. Lambert, who did lots of great maths, proved pi as irrational and did hyperbolic triangles and all sorts of things, but he invented photometry, which was really the first attempt to define quantities, scientific quantities for light, like albedo, which is just how much light is reflected. He proved some formulas for what's called form factors. So if you have two patches of surface, what is the transfer matrix really between different patches? The form factors. So, and all of this was completely ignored for 100 years because there was no practical use for it at all. This wasn't used until commercial lighting became a business. So with gas lighting first in the 19th century, and then later electric lighting. So he essentially invented photometry with candles and pieces of paper and a few bits of glass. Okay, so let's fast forward 200 years to a simplified abstract model. So this is quite an ad hoc model, but the first sort of really successful model of shading. So how is now? Can I find the laser pointer? The button marked pointer. So yes, how do we show shape? And the informal observation is that these bright highlights are, depending on the material, they can be wider or sharper, and they depend on the reflection angle. So you can build up this 3D appearance out of these terms. One is just a completely flat ambient light, the so-called diffuse part, which is just a cosine term with the normal direction and the light source, and then this specular term, which is a cosine raised to a specular power. So there's nothing properly physical about this. It's an informal model, but it does give you a 3D looking appearance. And it's particularly good for plastic. And this has already been mentioned. This is actually really the reason that Toy Story is about toys, is because toys are the thing they could render with Phong shading. And all of the lighting effects in Toy Story are hand-authored. So in every scene, there are lighting artists authoring every single part of it. So all of the indirect bounced light is put in by hand with light sources. And this, in the CGI industry, this went on for a surprisingly long time, perhaps. Ratatouille, which is another Pixar movie, was released in 2007. Everything's still done essentially by hand in that movie. A point light is inside a red point light is inside every tomato to make a little red glow. Very, very labor intensive, doesn't scale very well. But things have changed now, and this is really the sort of seminal text. So this picture, if you look very closely, you might notice this is actually a physically based rendering of the book, physically based rendering. This was really, I mean, the research wasn't new, but this was all codified and written down in one place, and this is the reference that the CGI industry in Hollywood used to go away. And nowadays, essentially all of the movie CGI is physically based realistic rendering. And how does this work? Well, we put in a whole pile of statistics, basically. Part of the trick is to make accurate measurements of materials, of various properties of materials. So first is reflectivity. The fact is that every single material is reflective to a greater or lesser extent. Diffusion and subsurface scattering, transparency and translucency. Fresnel reflectivity, which is a sort of, that's glancing reflectivity. So the edge of a curved object will appear white as the angle of light comes to complete grazing. Hard to explain, I don't have a picture of it, I'm afraid. And then metallicity, which is a silly word, but I'll explain in the next slide. So the idea here really is to treat the microsurface structure completely statistically and ensure all of the models conserve energy, which is very important to have a realistic system. Okay, so what is metallicity? The observation here is that, which I think was touched on earlier, is that conductors and insulators have very different behavior interacting with photons. So in conductors, essentially no light is transmitted because the photons get absorbed, but some are reflected. Whereas in insulators, they will bounce around inside a certain amount, and some of them will be emitted potentially somewhere else, and in random directions. So that's why you get a much more diffuse soft bounce in more directions. So it's more or less a yes/no question. Is the material a metal? Isn't it a metal? There are some in-between special cases, and the answer there is do not render them. Do not render semiconductor wafers, because they have strange behavior, but there aren't very many of them in the world. Okay, so to talk a bit about what we actually do with the surface statistics, the observation really, rough surfaces reflect in more directions. So a perfectly smooth surface, like a perfect mirror, light coming in one direction will be reflected in just one direction. That's sort of what it means for it to be a mirror. A very rough surface, you will have the macro surface, so like this wall over here. It looks like a flat wall, but in fact, if you look at it very close up, it will be quite rough on a small scale. So the microsurface will look more like this, and incoming light in one direction will be bounced in many directions. So the idea here is we don't want to model this surface accurately. That's way too much data. We model it statistically. So we say the normal directions of the surface have a certain statistical distribution, and in the end we're doing an integral over that distribution. And part of the formalism and the art of doing this is to introduce parameters that make sense to artists, like roughness. So what's the effect of roughness? Well, it's roughly this. This is a completely smooth rendered ball reflecting a lighting environment, and then as you increase the roughness parameter to be completely rough, you get a very diffuse metally surface there. And if you put this all together into a model, you expose artist-friendly parameters to the artists, you can get a wide variety of realistic-looking things, including our favourite. Now, I did not know why gold is gold before, so thank you for that. But the colour was measured, and it turned out to be golden colour, so that's what people put in the model. So this is great. This gives us a really powerful model of how light interacts with surfaces, and the key thing here is it separates out the authoring process, if you like, of the materials from the lighting. So you make your materials once, and you can reuse them in any lighting condition, and they will look correct because we've made a physically consistent model. You want to hide all the nasty maths, basically, in our statistical model, so no one using this actually has to understand the maths, really. We have intuitive parameters that we can expose. And another key thing is we want to restrict those parameters to physically sensible values. So although it makes sense in the equations to have a metallicity between 0 and 1, you don't really want to allow that because that's not a physically realistic material, and it will look strange. Okay, so that's all about the microsurface. A sort of short note about, if you like, millisurface. This is an image from Wikipedia, actually, to try and explain what is a normal map, as it's called. The idea is that, suppose I think this is a laser scan, a very detailed geometrical scan that we want to render, but we don't want to keep all 4 million triangles around, because that's a huge amount of data. So we can actually compress this to a much simpler surface, and then encode the finer details as deviations of the normal direction, and recreate an image that's not exactly the same, but very close. So this is a form of compression, but it can be completely invisible to the artist. The artist can work at full detail, and in our pipeline, we apply the compression. So that's, again, the shape affects lighting at this scale, but we can encode that in an efficient way. Okay, so we're getting towards where we come in eventually. This is great. We have a model of light interacting with surfaces directly, but to produce a complete, fully illuminated image, we need to account for multiple bounces of light. So light doesn't just hit a surface and bounce off once, it could bounce off multiple surfaces to fill in the entire scene. And this is, in fact, the full rendering equation is a very complicated integral. So the light value at one point is a hemispherical integral, and the incoming light along any of those directions could be coming from another surface, which is exactly the same hemispherical integral. So you have an enormous recursive integral to solve. But that's sort of fine because we have powerful computers nowadays and Monte Carlo methods. And this is tractable. So if you're making a movie, then, well, you just get a supercomputer. So Disney, for instance, Disney Animation, they have a top 100 supercomputer lying around for rendering movies on. And this all works. Huzzah. And this is really where we come in. So that's great, but what if we want to solve this problem for, let's say, a video game? So we're not pre-rendering a movie to master onto a DVD, we want to do something more dynamic. So in 2006, I came back to Cambridge and I joined Geomerics, a startup company here, and we set out to solve this global illumination problem, so how light bounces around multiple times in a scene for games in real time for all games, which was perhaps a little bit of a crazy target, but that's what we set out to do. And the real answer was, well, we simplified hugely. But it worked. We did eventually. So I can't take credit for everything in this image. There's lots and lots of very skilled artists and rendering engineers working for EA who are basically responsible for this. But our software is in there somewhere doing the indirect light. So that is a still from a Star Wars video game. There's actually a new one of these just come out this Christmas. That's Overwatch, a game that came out recently. That's a still from the latest FIFA game, which our technology is also in somewhere. So the sort of punchline is, it can be done, this stuff works. And how did we do this? Well, the strategy was really to try and understand shape now at the global scale. So the key computational difficulty in the global illumination problem is the visibility problem. It's what can see what else, and we wanted to encode that information in the smallest possible amount of data. Since the smaller your data, the faster you can churn through it at runtime. And how we did that was by building a geometrical hierarchy of the world based on position, normal direction that the geometry is facing in, and the visibility of what else it can see. So informally, the idea is that the geometry that's seen together at the same time, or likely to be seen at the same time, gets clumped together in this hierarchy. So here's a kind of a bad example. So hopefully you can see, this is actually one of our tiny little test assets, if you like. So each of these walls, there's walls here and here, and that's the sort of floor. So none of these areas are completely separated from these areas, say. And there's limited visibility across here. So this is the very first level of our tree where we cut everything up into tiny pieces. And then a bit further on, some things have been clumped together. So you can see that things that are visible roughly at the same time across this sort of hole here are getting clumped together. And then by the end, we have just things that can't actually see each other at all are separate at the coarsest level. So that's the sort of informally the idea of what we're really doing. So this would be awesome and glorious, but there are still a lot of challenges. So, and a lot of it has to do with how game worlds are actually constructed in practice. So it's very common to model a game world a bit like Lego pieces. You model each individual piece, so here you can see there's little bits of wall and some bits of floor. And these are all separate meshes, as they're called. They're just separate pieces that an artist somewhere has made. And then somewhere else, usually, a different artist is putting all these pieces together to make the level. And this is quite different to how the real world works. In the real world, if you've got two windows, you actually physically need two windows. They might be the same in the sense that they come off the same production line, but in the virtual world, you can actually literally render the same window in two different places. It's from the same bit of memory. And the important thing here is that to introduce variation, people often use the same pieces without regard for whether they really fit. So it doesn't matter actually if you have two pieces of wall that go through each other if you never see the back. It's more efficient to just reuse the same piece and shove it through the wall than to build a bespoke piece cut to size. But unfortunately, if you're trying to understand that geometry for visibility, you have to deal with all of these complications. So game artists, they're not architects. They're not building a building that has to actually stand up in the end, and no one cares about what it looks like from the other side. You only see it. It's a bit like a movie set, right? It's exactly, you only care about the bits you can see. So this introduces a lot of complications for us when actually processing the geometry. And the other thing that we do in understanding shape to make our system more efficient is we only really care about a fairly coarse level of indirect lighting. So this is similar to how normal maps work, but at a larger scale. For instance, over here there's a wall with a clock and some pictures, but in terms of the global indirect lighting in the room, it only really matters that this is a flat wall. So what we end up doing is having a thing called a target mesh. That's really just the very coarse outline of the geometry, and we project the more details onto this thing, but we end up simplifying our calculation by just considering the target mesh. Now, originally when we first did this, these target meshes had to be hand-authored, and this was a very time-consuming, error-prone process, made it hard to adopt the system, and in fact, a lot of the intervening 10 years was spent developing automated tools and systems partly for scaling up, because game worlds are getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and handling more data more efficiently. So that enabled Enlighten was integrated into Unity 5, so that's a very popular game engine that's actually used by millions of people. So it's quite a broadly adopted system now. But, so this is a sort of a punchline, in a sense this is actually disappointing, right? We're relying purely on heavyweight statistics and brute force. Whereas if you go right back to Lambert, if you know the world is made out of simple stuff, you can do analytic calculations to approximate the transfer for that stuff. So if we have to simplify the geometry anyway, can we create an algorithm to represent complicated scenes as simple primitives? So for us as humans, we sort of know what are walls, what are surfaces, what are cylinders, and actually most of the manufactured stuff in the world is made out of reasonably simple primitives all put together in a hierarchy. But reconstructing that from complicated input is actually a challenging problem. This is if we were starting again today, the fashionable thing is well, this is really it's a machine learning computer vision problem. Can we recover the simplified shape of the world from the complex geometry? And this is something that, for instance, if you want to make a robot that can understand and interact with the world, you also need to solve a very related problem. You have messy, noisy sensor input, and you need to understand the geometry in the world. But yes, so the very sort of end of the story is, sadly, so GMX was acquired by ARM. So I currently work for ARM. GMX was acquired by ARM about 4 years ago, but ARM have decided to no longer work on this problem. So we're no longer developing the software, sadly. But that's the end of the story. So thank you for listening.
Very well.
Is it really the purpose to get it as realistic looking as possible? I mean, isn't I don't really, for example, go to movies to see these kinds of films. I haven't seen Toy Story, which shows how immature I am. But isn't part of the appeal that it's not quite real?
I mean, yes and no. I think technically, from the technical point of view, the big payoff, the big benefit of this formalism and doing it this way is it works and it makes all of your work reusable. So you can take an object and you can put it in different lighting and it will look correct. So rather than having to make completely bespoke things for every single shot. So given that, you can then push your lighting values to physically unrealistic things. So you can still very much sculpt your but actually a lot of this happens in if you like, in the cinematography, right? I mean, even footage shot on film doesn't necessarily look real, because you will, in the end, color grade it and put all sorts of effects, and there's lots of post-processing. But I guess they want to sort of regularize CGI with the traditional movie making pipeline. But you could ask the same question about the history of fine art, right? There was a period when people were trying to render more and more and more realistic looking paintings. And then I mean, this is just my informal, I'm by no means an art historian, but then at a certain point that no longer happened, right? The cutting edge of art became about something else. And that will probably also happen here, right? If history is our guide.
You described rendering surfaces by separating the roughness from the macro. Now, if the surface is a fractal, which to a good approximation it is, for example, for mountain landscapes, fractal dimension at 2.3, you can't separate the micro scale from the macro scale because there's a continuum of scales in between. But you do render mountains rather well, so how do you do it?
By ignoring the fact that you can't do that separation and just doing the separation anyway. Yes, formally there is no difference, right? It's all stuff all the way down. But you have to make an arbitrary choice of this separation. So long as you do it cleverly, then, because in the end you only have a fixed pixel resolution. So long as you do it at the sort of level where you can no longer see the difference in the pixels, because certainly when, you know, if you're in one of these games and you walk up and you're on the mountain, then it is really rendering the rocks. It will genuinely be rendering details as geometry. But then if you go away, a lot of the actual sort of machinery behind the scenes of the game engine is coping with the level of detail of just the geometry itself. So that when you're a kilometer away, it's just rendering the outline with a picture of what the rocks look like rather than the rocks themselves.
So it's a comment about I really like the photorealistic rendering, but then I also really like these 1970s model phone rendering model, because these are, I think it is because it is a toy model that explains some of the behavior of light. And if you compare with the real one, then you have the difference between them, which then you get aware of these color bleeding effect or subsurface scattering that cannot be represented by this method. And so, well, it is just a comment about that.
Yeah, it's certainly, the photoreal is not the only way to render things, and you'll see many games, certainly, where they don't use photorealistic rendering because they're making a different artistic choice, if you like. It's perfectly valid.
One last question, Steve?
Well, that was sort of my point. I've seen a lot of these movies because my kids are the right age, but it seems to me like Ratatouille, for example, is almost hyper-realistic. But it isn't the real world. It doesn't look like.
Well, indeed, and that is,
It's
I
clear
think,
they have a physics in mind.
that's one of the last Pixar movies which didn't use any of the physically based rendering formalism.
And Tintin is also. It's clear that they want it to look like the comic book, but it's a whole physical world with the physics that looks like the comic book somehow.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, so we actually did some work when we were, so funnily enough, when we were doing a big sales pitch in Japan, we did some work to do stylized, more anime-style rendering, but with in a 3D context where the light levels in the world were broadly physically correct. So you're taking the same data that we generate and then doing a more stylized rendering with it.
It seems like you can kind of play with the physics of a world of your.
Yeah, but in the end, it's just a massive productivity saver, because the old way of having to author literally all of the lighting by hand for every shot is just a killer.
Right. So instead, you just change physics in that world so that everything is softly lit or whatever.
I mean, one of the big differences between a CGI movie today and one from 10 and certainly 20 years ago, it's just the amount of stuff that's in the world. It's partly because they just have more computing power and they can render it now, but it's partly because with these better tools, they can generate more stuff much more quickly because it's much more automated.
One last question before we break for.
Now, because for you, realistic means as it appears to people looking at it. But it's worth, since this meeting is about more general notions within you, it's worth mentioning this is far from obvious that you can use the word real. I mean, when the painters in the Caliphate, for example, in Turkey, first encountered perspective as brought from the West, there was a serious discussion about whether it was un-Islamic to paint a mosque small just because it was far away, when you know that really it's big. It's not obvious at all.
I heard a similar story about a Russian movie that showed a famous black and white Russian movie, which was taken out into the extremes of Siberia and shown to the locals, and they got angry when there was a headshot on the screen, because where's the rest of the person?
Exactly.
All right, let's thank Brian again. Thank you.
Thank you.